Well, the last attempt didn't really work too well, so I wanted to try it again. Technical issues on the last one. And also, I think... I don't know whether I like the idea of a performance of T.S. Eliot as much as I like just a reading of T.S. Eliot. So I wanted to capture something of the majesty and the, I think, power of that poem, but it's a little close to my heart, I gotta say. So I also wanted to capture something of this. I mean, it's a wild and woolly day out, filled with the ruach of God. The ruach is the breath of God that he breathes into the nostrils of Adam and Eve. And it's filled with that. You know, it's one of these days where the ozone is thick, as they might say in a modern context. So what I thought might be good, and also, it wasn't 5 o'clock yet. Now it's 5 o'clock, so here we are, right, with the fortifications and everything. Now, this is a Radler beer, by the way. It's a grapefruit-infused beer, and I've really taken a shine to it. It's what the bikers in France and Germany would drink at the end of one of their rides. So it's grapefruit mixed with beer, and you could have like lemon mixed with beer, orange juice mixed with beer, kind of like a champagne and orange juice, that sort of thing. Similar concept. Humans have been brewing or venting or distilling all sorts of booze from really early on in our history. It's like apparently evidence of some form of alcohol making goes way, 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 way back into our history. So we've always found some ways to make drinks a little bit more spiky. And that's what a Radler does. It gives you a refreshing bit of vitamin C along with your beer. So I thought today would be good to try this again. The wind is pretty high, and so I'm worried that the tripod might be knocked over and we might get cut off, but we'll try it again. And this time I'd like to capture, if I can, something of this wild and woolly sky rather than just me talking like a talking head. Not the band either, but this. This whole thing. Because, you get tired of that after a while, right? So, far more interesting to see the actual world. So let's try it. I'm going to flip the camera here. We'll see what happens. Boink. And there it is. The wild and woolly earth. We'll set the camera down. Hopefully it won't fall. The Wasteland. Part 5. What the Thunder Said. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation is now dead. Oh, that's my wife. Hang on a second. Yes, I'm doing a live broadcast on Facebook.
Oh, great.
Yeah, you're on.
Woohoo.
Okay, I'm going to start over now.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Love you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Lassiter. Catch her on her own Facebook page. She makes occasional appearances unexpectedly in the middle of things. So there it is. And I love her for it. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, Part 5. What the Thunder Said. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation, a thunder of spring over distant mountains. He who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying, with a little patience. Here is no water, but only rock. Rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock one cannot stop or think. There's not even silence in the mountains, but dull thunder without rain. There's not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water, and no rock, if there were rock, and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, drop, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look up ahead on the white road, there's always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? What is that sound? High in the air, murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is the city over the mountain? Cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air. Falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London. Unreal. A woman drew her hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on those strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings and crawled head downward down a blackened wall. And upside down in air were towers, tolling reminiscent bells that kept the hours, and voices singing out of empty cisterns and exhausted wells. In this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing. Humped in silence. Then spoke the thunder. Da! Data. What have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, daring of a moment's surrender, which age or prudence can never retract. In this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries, or in memories draped by the beneficent cider, wheels broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Da! Dayadvam. I have heard the key turn in the door once, and turn once only. We think swallow, swallow. Le prince d'Aquitaine à la Tuileries. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why then I'll fight ya. Hieronymo's mad again. Data. Diadvam. Damyata. Shanti. 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 There are notes to this poem, and as a matter of fact, I've read before versions where the notes are they're just extensive, because it's hard to understand a great deal of what's going on in this poem without these extensive notes. And the editor here of my text, check out who that is for scholarly reasons, n'est-ce pas? There's a Harcourt, Brace and World Incorporated, New York, edited by Esme. No. Edited by, I don't know who it is. Edited by somebody. It doesn't say. But the editor here provides notes that allow us to have some insight into what references he's making. Because throughout this poem, he's just making hundreds of references to various pieces of literature and cultural things that we don't have direct access to. So some of the things that work here, I thought it's interesting. This is back in the Burial of the Dead section. It says, I'm not familiar with the exact combination of the tarot pack of cards from which I have obviously departed to suit my own convenience. Must be T.S. Eliot's own note. The Hanged Man, a member of the traditional pack, fits my purpose in two ways. Because he is associated in my mind with the hanged god of Fraser, and because I associate him with the hooded figure in the passage of the disciples to Emmaus in part 5. The Phoenician sailor and the merchant appear later, also the crowds of people, and death by water is executed in part 4. The man with 3 staves, an authentic member of the tarot pack, I associate quite arbitrarily with the Fisher King himself. So one of the things that comes up over and over in the poem is this image of the Fisher King. And you see that in the Phoenician, Phlebas the Phoenician, and the sitting fishing by the arid plain behind him in the last part of the poem. And it's an image which Eliot discovered in the Arthurian cycle, the stories of Arthur and the court of Camelot. The Fisher King was a king who had a near lethal wound that would not heal, but did not kill him, and so it kept him alive in excruciating pain for years and years and years. And he was only healed when finally Perceval came and asked the right questions of the Grail ceremony. And when he did that, Perceval was allowed to have the Grail come to him, and he was able to give the Fisher King a drink from the Grail, the Holy Grail, which healed him immediately. And all the land around, which had become arid and dissolute, was suddenly refreshed, renewed. Rain fell on the land and it burgeoned with new life. Now, of course, the poem isn't explicit about this, but the hint of the poem is the Fisher King's wound is a sexual wound, that he's been hurt in his manly areas. And because of that, he is incapable of producing new life. He's incapable of engaging in love with his own wife. And he's incapable of ruling his land as a king ought to, because he has this terrible wound. The medievals were not nearly as squeamish about such things as we are, just for the record. And for them, it was perfectly obvious that a king who wasn't able to exercise his manly duty was not able to really rule with potency. The very word itself meaning manliness, potens, potency, possibility. So Perceval, who heals him through the Grail, does this great act of mercy that fixes everything. and allows rain to fall on the land again. We go back to what Eliot was struggling with, his own personal issues with basically with impotence and with his own wife that he had with Bertrand Russell, cuckolding him with his wife. But I think also he saw on a larger scale that there was this problem in Europe that was a problem of impotency, that we had become a culture, or Europe had become a culture that no longer had the power to rule itself. 1922, remember, the poem was written. And so the Fisher King becomes this thematic element in the poem, which kind of ties the poem together, because from the very beginning it's an important image. Ties the poem together and reminds the reader that there's this terrible wound that our culture is suffering through. You can extend it into America in our modern era, consequently. The terrible wound that we suffer through. What is it? Is it a sexual wound? Is it a wound of the heart? Is it an emotional wound? Is it the wound of abortion? Is it the wound of contraception, which leads to abortion? Is it the wound of our society's acceptance of infanticide or euthanasia or the cheapening of human life? I think the answer is yes. It's all that. That's the Fisher King, see. The Fisher King is this character who can no longer be fully human because he's lost that thing that distinguishes him as a man. And he needs Percival, the original Arthur character, the original character of the Arthurian cycle, to heal him. Percival was the great poem of Europe, by the way, not so much. It was really Percival, the character that everybody referred to. And the Arthur story is sort of modeled on that, or crafted on that. So that poem of Percival, especially Wolfram von Eschenbach's version, was the poem that dominated the culture and was the one that they always referred to. So Eliot is making that part of his main imagery. But one of the other images he brings up is this image of the tarot deck and the cards and Madame Sosostris. And at the time of Eliot's writing, 1922, and just before it, there was a very powerful mystical presence in Europe, because Europe had drifted away from its Christian roots and no longer saw any meaning in Christianity itself, and consequently had turned to mysticism, which is a very different thing. Getting in touch with the dead spirits and having seances and listening to the mediums that would tell us how to live our lives in accordance with the spiritual energies of the universe. It turns out, by the way, a little known fact, one of the major characters of that mystical movement, Madame Blavatsky, she had deep influences over a lot of people in Europe, including those who had suffered through World War I on the frontline trenches. And three characters in particular in Germany were very influenced by her, by the name of Adolf, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, were deeply influenced by Madame Blavatsky. Does that mean that all mysticism is bunk or leads to Nazism? No, what it means, though, is that mystical element, which was a searching for meaning, I think, in the universe, led to some very dangerous, violent, murderous results. And again, it was because I think Europe had divorced itself in Australia, and he quotes from He quotes from Parzival, the poem, and he says about Tiresias, the character Tiresias, although a mere spectator, and not indeed a character, he is yet the most important personage in the poem, uniting all the rest of the poem. Just as the one-eyed merchant, seller of currants, melts into the Phoenician sailor, and the latter is not wholly distinct from Ferdinand, Prince of Naples, so all the women are one woman, and the two sexes meet in Tiresias. What Tiresias sees, in fact, is the substance of the poem. The whole passage from Ovid is of great anthropological interest, and then he has this whole Latin section that he quotes from Ovid. But the point being that Tiresias was a prophet, a Greek prophet, and Tiresias came across two snakes mating, and he struck them. And those two snakes that he struck were sacred to Hermes, the god Hermes, who then cursed him. Or maybe it was Apollo, I forget. But anyway, he cursed Tiresias, and Tiresias had to suffer by switching his form to a woman for several years. And then he switched back to a man. And that we see that image in what's called the caduceus, which is the image of the medical world. If you know two snakes bound around a staff with wings, it's the caduceus. It's a symbol of Tiresias, who is seen as a prophet and a healer in the ancient world. And in this poem, he's the prophet. He's the man who sees the patterns of the world, because that's what a prophet does. He sees the patterns. Anyway, continuing with some of the notes, he quotes also from Götterdämmerung and the Vicar of Wakefield, and he quotes from the documents about Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, from Purgatorio, St. Augustine's Confessions, which is to Carthage, then I came, where a cauldron of unholy loves sang all about mine ears. He quotes from Buddha, which is, again, an interesting little bit of history, that Eastern philosophy, along with mysticism, had become very popular in Europe. And there was a whole movement called Easternism, where Europeans had become enchanted not just with China. Japan was unknown at the time, really. They were enchanted not only with China, but also with the Middle East and with Persia and all that, the culture there, Mesopotamia. And so he's basically quoting from the Buddha at one point. The Buddha has what's called the Fire Sermon. It says here, the complete text of the Buddha's Fire Sermon, which corresponds in importance to the Sermon on the Mount, from which these words are taken, will be found translated in the late Henry Clark Warren's Buddhism in Translation. Mr. Warren was one of the great pioneers of Buddhist studies in the Occident. Right? Occident that's us, it's the Western world. Orient is the Eastern world. Terms no longer used as much. But that's why we orient ourselves, and we go through orientation, because we're turning towards the East. You might ask yourself, well, why is that important? Why do we turn towards the East? It's because all ancient structures used to be oriented towards the sun and the stars, and you had to find out where the East was, where the sun rose, in order to be able to build your cathedrals or to build your cities, so that the sun would come through the doors on a specific day. That's why you see all the major cathedrals of Europe are oriented towards the east. Their major openings are towards the south, but their rose windows are towards the east. And then he quotes again from Confessions, and he says what the thunder said. He says, in the first part 5, 3 themes are employed: the journey to Emmaus, the approach to the Chapel Perilous, and the present decay of Eastern Europe. He goes on to quote all sorts of things, and here's something I thought was really interesting. He actually quotes from Shackleton, Ernest Shackleton. The following lines were stimulated by the account of one of the Antarctic expeditions, I forget which, but I think one of Shackleton's. It was related that the party of explorers, at the extremity of their strength, had the constant delusion that there was one more member than could actually be counted. That's where they're talking about who is that beside you, the shadow and all that. Ernest Shackleton's if you ever want a really harrowing read, or you find this on Amazon, find out about Ernest Shackleton. It's a really fascinating story. He was searching for the South Pole, and his group, basically the ship, the Endurance, got stuck in the ice, got trapped in the ice, and was there for a year, basically. And before he was able to escape from the ship that was crushed by the ice, and he escaped north through the frozen ocean, the icy ocean, to Elephant Island, and his men stayed there on Elephant Island while he and a few people went north again to a small whaling outpost. And he got help. They were rescued. All the men survived. Ironically, they came back to the war that was ongoing, and they didn't have any recognition because so many men had been killed on the back. Nobody cared that Ernest Shackleton and his men had survived. Such is life. Then here are some important things, I think, in understanding the poem. First is that the words data, dayadvam, damyata mean give, sympathize, and control. The fable of the meaning of the thunder is found in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I'll mispronounce that. And a translation is found in a work by Tennyson. So give, sympathize, and control. And then also notice that he starts off each one with a thunder, so da, 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 da. My friend who played the tabla back in college, it's an Indian drum, he says that all the beats on the drum have different names, each name corresponding to a specific type of on the drum. Da is the initial beat that you make. So that sound that he uses, da, which is also the opening of the words, data, dayadvam, and damyata, is a drum sound, And if you want to listen to something spectacular, listen to Zakir Hussain doing a drum solo on the tabla, and you'll hear him sometimes sound out the drum beats, so you can hear what I'm talking about. Then he quotes from Purgatory, and he ends with this word Shanti. And Shanti is a word from Indian again, which says repeated as here, is a formal ending to an Upanishad. And it basically means something like the peace which passeth understanding, equivalent to that word. Shanti just means peace in Indian and Sanskrit. So lots of notes, and there are more notes that you can glean from other copies. Those are Eliot's own notes. Now, I guess I'll finish up here because it is chilly out. My goodness, it's cold. I'll finish up with this. Why is this poem at all important, especially in our era? First off, it broke the mold of what poetry was doing at the time. Most poetry of the 19th century and then of the early 20th century was extremely sentimental, very formalized. The last great poet was Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was a fantastic poet. But his poetry is very formalized, very structured, sometimes a little sentimental, as much as I love Tennyson. The great poetry of the earlier eras had assumed that people understood what they were referring to. So there's this kind of bulk of culture that everybody had reference to. And T.S. Eliot's poetry, not just this one but others, it broke that mold. He wrote in a style which not only did not have the same rhyme scheme or rhythm, but itself was making reference to things that people wouldn't have gotten immediately. And it sort of flows without structure. Consequently, the poem, it's hard to refer to everything and what does this mean or what does that mean. It's rather you have to kind of take it as a whole and then come back to it again and again and again, I think. But it really changed the way poetry was thought about in the 20th century. My father didn't like T.S. Eliot at all, couldn't stand him. Thought that he had done damage to poetry and really wrecked what poetry was about by taking away that formal structure. But my father also couldn't deny that T.S. Eliot's poem rang into every other poem after him and every other song after him. I mean, you listen to modern music or music from the 60s and 70s, or you listen to even jazz music, for instance, like Dave Brubeck. And that musical format, which was so free form, so free flowing, really owes a great deal to what T.S. Eliot did. The Wasteland not only was a great poem in its own right, but it was a great poem in that it influenced so many artists afterwards and had a permanent effect on Western culture and Western poetry. So we owe him a great debt. I think it's a wonderful poem. It's a fantastic poem, and I'm more than happy to talk at length with anybody who had questions about it. What does this mean, or what does that mean? But for now, I'm thinking it's getting chill out again. It's Minnesota, so we don't expect to get warm here until about July. And right now it's April, so we're still in the freezer. And I need to refresh myself with a little bit more Radler and get indoors. So I thank you all for joining me. I think what I will read next, I've thought about it a lot and looked at what I have in my library, which is in chaos right now. I think what I'll do next is read from Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. If you have a copy of that, that's great. I'll start tomorrow if I can. If you don't have a copy and you just want to listen in, I'll just be reading from her text and take it chapter by chapter. We'll go with that, without explaining a great deal. I mean, it's just a great story. And until we meet again, I thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you stay safe and stay healthy. God be with you. Oh, and do check out some of those websites that I'm always making reference to. So anyway, God be with you.